Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Fuentes, one of the high school counselors. We're so glad that we are able to bring you our second virtual financial aid night. Thanks so much, Mr. Hosier, for being here. We also have the other high school counselors, Kevin Fleck and Jamie Brookman. But most importantly, we know that as we've been having lots of conversations about planning for life after Edgemont, the students are all excited to learn about what friends they're going to meet and classes they're going to take and where they're going to live. And I think that this audience may be also trying to figure out, yes, and how much is that going to cost and how am I going to pay for it? So we wanted to bring an expert to you to answer those questions. So I wanted to introduce everybody to Maximo Flint Morgan. He presently is the Director of Financial Aid at Lemoyne College in Syracuse. For 10 years, he's been working in financial aid, having previously worked, he's fairly new to Lemoyne, right? Just this year, and the previous several years at Syracuse University. And prior to that, and he's the regional chair of New York State Financial Aid Administrators Association, and he works at, he's very active in the National Financial Aid Association as well. So we're really lucky to have Maximo with us, and I will let him speak to you all because you have us all year.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for hosting me at Edgemont. I'm going to work on sharing my screen and begin my presentation. Let's see, Stephanie, can you see this? Is this being displayed? Awesome, I'm getting a thumbs up. That's great and wonderful. So as Stephanie said, my name is Maximo Flint Morgan, and I'm the Director of Financial Aid at Lemoyne College. I'm also a member of NASFA, which is the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. And today we're going to talk about what it is that you need to know about financial aid and the financial aid process. I believe there is a Google form where you all can submit some questions. If at any point in time you have a question about what it is that I'm saying, please don't hesitate to submit those questions, and Stephanie and folks will be able to send those through.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, let's keep the questions for the purposes of this evening. The questions should be more general and that they would apply to kind of that they're not specific to just you. Those questions can really be directed to financial aid officers at a school that your child is researching, possibly attending. And Mr. Fleck will be monitoring the questions and bringing them into the conversation as the topics arise. So, you know, throughout the presentation, you can use that form.
Wonderful. So now that we've gotten through the ground rules, let us begin on the journey of financial aid and what it is that you need to know. So some topics that we're going to talk about is what is financial aid? We're going to discover the cost of attendance, the EFC or the expected family contribution, financial need, the categories, the types, the sources of financial aid, the primary application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, and then what happens if your financial life isn't neat and tidy and like everybody else's is real life. What do you do? What are your special circumstances, and how can you speak to financial aid officers about them? So to begin, what is financial aid? Financial aid consists of funds provided to students and families to help pay for post-secondary educational expenses, also known as expenses for education after high school, after secondary education. Anything and everything that is used for those educational endeavors is considered financial aid. And the first part of trying to figure out how much money is what is the cost of attendance, right? So the cost of attendance includes tuition and fees. It includes room and meals or room and board. It includes books and supplies. It includes transportation and miscellaneous personal expenses. So it's everything and anything from shoelaces to shampoo. If you're attending college and you're living there, that's part of the cost of attendance. What is the expected family contribution, right? So, or the EFC. The EFC is a measurement of a student's ability and family's and their family's ability to pay post-secondary educational expenses. And it is composed of the student contribution and then the parent contribution if you're a traditional dependent student. So there's a part from the student and their income and their assets, and the other part from the parent and their income and their assets. And that both of those sum to the EFC. So those two things come out to help us figure out what is financial need, right? So it's the cost of attendance for a particular institution that you're researching or that you're applying for, minus your expected family contribution or your EFC that will equal your financial need, right? So one thing that we'll cover during this presentation is the extreme creativity that financial aid officers have when trying to talk about all of these different kinds of money and acronyms. So
and Maximo,
forward,
if I could just jump in because it's kind of relevant to what you just said. We did have a question that just came through about, is there a number for household income that prevents an award for financial aid?
There isn't a specific cutoff, right? Because a lot of the income information would have to also be applicable to your household size and the number of students that are attempting undergraduate study, right? So it's not, well, I made $100,000 and therefore there is no financial aid for me. It's unfortunately not that simple, cut and dry. It's very unique to each individual family's income and situation. So I would at least encourage anyone who's considering attending college in the next year to complete a FAFSA to figure out your EFC. If your EFC is above the cost of attendance, there might not be need, but you might be eligible for other aid, which we're gonna go over here briefly. Any other questions, Mr. Fleck, that have come in so far?
So actually, there is a question that came in kind of right off the bat. How does the financial aid process work for students who are considered international students because of their immigration status, even though they completed the high school years in the United States?
So depending, there are a couple of slides regarding that that I have coming up. It will depend on your own circumstances. So we'll address that one shortly. And then if there are still questions, please feel free to ask at that time. All right, so to go back to the extreme creativity of financial aid administrators, how do we slice and dice financial aid? There are two ways of categorizing it. There is need-based aid, and then there is non-need-based aid. Again, really truly showing our creative colors here. The types of financial aid, we also have self-help aid on the left and gift aid on the right. So first up on the gift aid, between the 12 o'clock and the 3 o'clock quarter of the pie there, we have scholarships, right? And so these are funds that do not have to be repaid, that are awarded either by a private entity or the individual school or college that you are attending, based on some characteristics. So sometimes it can be talent-based or merit-based. It can really just depend on you and the entity. Next up, we have grants. These are also funds that do not have to be repaid. They are oftentimes based on need, and can vary in amounts depending on the entity that's providing them. So whether it's a federal grant or a state grant possibly, or an institutional grant from the individual school or college that you're attending. Then we have work study or employment. And so these are funds that a student would work for and then would be paid in lieu of their services. At some institutions, that can be a paycheck paid directly to the student, subtracting for state and federal taxes that would be applicable to their income. At other institutions, it may just equate to a reduction in billable charges like tuition production or something like that. And last but not least, loans. And so these would be funds that would have to be paid back, and they can be borrowed from an institution, from a private bank or lender, or from a federal or state government. The sources of financial aid, there's multiple sources: the federal government, states, colleges and universities, private sources, and even sometimes employers offer financial aid or tuition benefits for their employees. So to begin, the largest source of financial aid would be the federal government. And this would be aid provided primarily on the basis of financial need, as once you complete a FAFSA, right? And you would have to apply each year to the FAFSA that you want to be considered for the federal aid. And there are certain eligibility requirements that must be met from a standpoint of, well, is there need? And if it's not a need-based award, is there citizenship or other requirements there? Here is a listing of the federal student aid programs, right? So from left to right, there's the federal Pell Grant, the Iraq-Afghanistan Service Grant, the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or FSEOG, the Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education, or the TEACH Grant, which is misnamed. It's really a loan. So a lot of folks in financial aid call that a groan because it's a hybrid of a loan and a grant that could be forgiven if there's certain service requirements met, but it may not be. It may be a loan. There are federal work study funds, the federal direct student loan program, as well as the federal plus loan program for parents and or graduate students. Next up, we have states, right? So states themselves, in addition to the federal government, have financial aid programs. Oftentimes, residency requirements apply, so you must be attending a school in that state, and your permanent address must be from that state. Aid may be provided on the basis of both merit and need. They use information from the FAFSA and or other state aid applications, and each state will have its own deadline, and they have their own requirements regarding eligibility. So in the state of New York, as an example, the Tuition Assistance Program or the TAP Grant Program, students don't have to be citizens in order to be eligible for the TAP grant through the passing of the DREAM Act that recently happened, and recently being in the past 2 years. So again, another funding source that families should consider applying for. Next up, colleges and universities. So colleges and universities provide aid on the basis of both merit and need. Aid may be gift aid or free money or self-help aid, so work study or some loans. Colleges and universities will use the information from the FAFSA, as well as institutional applications. So some universities will use the CSS Profile to determine eligibility for their own institutional funds. So deadlines and application requirements will vary from one institution to another. So every school may have their own financial aid application, and will have their own a deadline or timeline for applying, similar to the admissions process, except in this case, it would be for money, for financial aid purposes. Then there are also private sources. So foundations and businesses, churches, civic and charitable organizations, they will have their own specific deadlines and application procedures, and those will vary. And students and their families should begin researching private sources really early. I do encourage students to prioritize their local private entities in their scholarships searches, because you would have a higher probability of being awarded funding, right? So in my small town, in my county, there are probably 5 different Rotary clubs that have scholarships. Each one will only award it to their home high school district or districts. And so if those folks are graduating maybe 200 people a year, out of those 200, say maybe 20 apply, your student would have a 1 in 20 chance of winning this scholarship. If you're applying for a national scholarship, it's one student versus the rest of the country applying for that same scholarship, and just by sheer numbers, you will have a lower probability of winning it. So please consider local scholarship opportunities and prioritize them. Lastly, employers. So some employers may have scholarships available to the children of employees, So some dependent tuition benefits possibly, or at a particular school or college, the owner of the place of employment may have created an endowed scholarship that's only available to students who graduate from a particular place and are only attending that school, or whose parents work at a particular place and are attending that school. And so researching employers, again, can be a high probability place to find some additional funding. They may have educational benefits for their employees as well. So if it's a chain of Burger Kings that are owned across 4 or 5 different states, and that one business that owns all of these has a scholarship for a particular school or college, that might be an opportunity for students. The FAFSA, the free application for federal student aid. A brief crash course, if you will, right? So the FAFSA will collect a demographic and financial information for students and, if applicable, their parents. The information is used to calculate the expected family contribution, which is, again, the Superfund acronym of EFC. It's not really what you should expect to pay. It works more like a financial index to gauge your eligibility for things like the Pell Grant or other grants and loans. Colleges use the EFC to offer financial aid, particularly federal aid programs. And then some institutions will use it for their institutional need-based programs. And the FAFSA is available in English and Spanish. It's available in, I want to say, 8 other languages on the app. You can also request it in paper in a few other languages as well, should you have that need. So the FAFSA may be filed at any time during an academic year, but no earlier than October 1st prior to the academic year for which the student requests aid. So for the 22-23 academic year, so not this fall, but next fall, the earliest that you could do a FAFSA is October 1st of this year. So you start senior year, it becomes October 1st, and you can do a FAFSA. You can complete it, submit all of the information. Colleges may set FAFSA priority dates. It varies from one school to another. I think all financial aid folks will say, apply early, apply often. It's certainly not going to hinder you. It can only help you. So how could you complete a FAFSA? There are a multitude of ways. You could do it online, FAFSA on the web. You could do it via mobile app through the MyFAFSA or the My Student Aid mobile app. You could complete a paper FAFSA, even though it would be significantly slower if you do so. You could complete a FAFSA over the phone. And you could also use the FAA Access to CPS Online portal, which is not user-friendly. It's meant more for financial aid professionals, even though students and families have access. Highly recommend FAFSA on the web or the My Student Aid mobile app. Why would I recommend these things? Well, Mr. Fleck, that's an excellent question. I'm glad you asked it. The FAFSA on the web and the My Student Aid app have built-in edits to prevent costly errors. So the FAFSA in its paper form, you will be able to see and read all 100 and some odd questions of it. If you do it online, it will only show you questions that you need to answer. It will help you bypass questions that you don't need to answer. Why is that important? Well, because it removes the opportunity for students and their families to incorrectly report information, to key in 1 or 2 too many zeros so that it looks like you made $1 million last year when in fact it was maybe $10,000 last year, right? So it removes the opportunity for errors. So skip logic allows student and or parent to skip unnecessary questions. Also, it allows you the option to use the IRS Data Retrieval tool to automatically import your tax data. And that's really, really helpful because it will also alleviate some paper processing that the financial aid office may require you to do on the back end. Some more benefits of FAFSA on the web or My Student Aid: more timely submission of original application and any necessary corrections. If you have to add another school to your FAFSA, it's really easy to do. If you don't know how to answer a question, there is a help feature on all of the questions. It's a little question mark button. You also have the ability to check the application status online, whereas if you did it on paper, you'd have to mail it and then hope it makes it to the Department of Education. And it also allows for a simplified application process in the future. So you'll have access to a renewal application instead of having to start at square one again. So how would you do the FAFSA on the web? If you go to studentaid.gov and under apply for aid, it'll come down and say new to the FAFSA process, start here. That's where you would start. You would start at the start here button. If you're a returning user, you would log in with your returning information. And this is what it would look like. You log into the FAFSA. You would log in as the student or the parent, whoever is driving the computer at that point in time, and then click next and move forward through the questions. If you were going to do it on the app, which again is one of the preferred options, you have the ability of downloading the app, saving it, and submitting the FAFSA. Again, you open it up and you would click start here, and then you would begin based on who you are, either it's the parent or the student. If you happen to be paying a preparer, they would have to click the I am a preparer button. And then you would continue with creating a save key. The information on the app is protected the same way as it is on the web. And it will also prompt you to create a save key. So if you get 3 or 4 steps in, but you didn't complete all of them, you can save it and return to it later. That's a feature that's both on the app as well as the FAFSA on the web. And it'll track how far you've gone, right? So here, here's on the left, section 1, student information has begun. Once you complete it, it'll show you a little green check mark. It'll tell you your progress has been saved and you've completed a milestone, but keep going because you're still not done. You will have to, on the My Student Aid app, click the agreement and terms checkbox. Please read it as you would all other agreement and terms for any other website that you're signing up for. It will show you a confirmation of submission, and it will estimate your EFC calculation. So in this example, Tammy successfully completed her FAFSA. Within 7 to 10 business days, the department is going to mail the student aid report, and it shows the estimated EFC, which is $12,721. And based on that, it says right there in plain English, based on your EFC, you are not eligible for a federal Pell Grant. However, you may be able to receive other federal, state, or institutional aid resources. Please complete the survey if you wish. If you were applying at a state, or if you wanted to also apply for state aid after you complete your FAFSA, is the very best time to complete any state aid application that you may be needing to do, because all the information will be right there. The IRS Data Retrieval Tool, or the DRT, financial aid folks, we do love our acronyms. The data retrieval tool allows for certain tax information to be transferred directly from the IRS to your FAFSA. The FAFSA requires income information for folks who filed income tax returns from 2 years ago. So for the 22-23 school year, you're looking for your 2020 income tax information. The participation of using that tool is voluntary, and the student can choose whether or not to transfer the data from FAFSA onto the web. The parent also has a similar choice. The IRS will authenticate who is requesting the information, and if a tax record is found, the IRS will automatically put the right answers onto your FAFSA for you. And as I said, it can reduce the amount of documents that are requested by the financial aid office in the back end. Oftentimes, the Department of Education will select a FAFSA or a student to be verified, which is a process where the financial aid office will have to ask for substantiating income information. So we'd have to ask for your W-2s and 1099s and your 1040 from the income of the year reported. So for 22-23, that would be the income tax year of 2020. If you wanted to bypass the need for that, the IRS data retrieval tool is the best way of doing so. There are certain folks who are not eligible for the IRS data retrieval tool. folks who did not say on their FAFSA that they filed a tax return, folks whose marriage date is January 2021 or later, so January 1st, 2021 or later, folks whose first 3 digits of SSN are 666, folks who filed a non-US tax return if you worked abroad, married and filed head of household, or if you are married and filed married filing separately. If neither married parent entered a valid social, then the IRS data retrieval tool is not an option. Non-married parent or both parents entered all zeros for their social, you would not be able to use the IRS data retrieval tool. The FSA ID is the function in which students and parents can electronically sign their FAFSA. So you would have to create an FSA ID to sign and submit your FAFSA, one FSA ID for the student and then a different one for the parent. It may be used by students and parents throughout the financial aid process, including subsequent school years. So it's a thing that you'd want to create and write down somewhere and keep handy for sophomore year's FAFSA filing, junior year's FAFSA filing, senior year's FAFSA filing, all of these things. Only one owner should create an FSA ID, meaning a student has their own FSA ID and then a parent has their own FSA ID. Each parent should have their own FSA ID, but you can choose which parent is actually signing and submitting the FAFSA if a parent is required in your situation. There is a link to create your FSA ID here on the slide deck. It's also on the FAFSA on the web application, so don't worry. You can't really miss it. It won't let you submit a FAFSA without an FSA ID created, so there will be more prompts for this. If you are anti the web, if you don't want to use the app, you can use the worksheet to preview questions or to kind of get a head start on filling it out on paper, right? So you can FAFSA on the web worksheet allows you to preview the questions that may be asked regarding the information for the student and for the parent. What information from the student? We're going to need social security number, citizenship status, marital status, drug conviction of possession or sale, selective service registration for males only, and highest educational level completed by father or mother. The FAFSA will also ask you a slew of questions to figure out if parent information is needed, right? So to figure out your dependency status. And that is for FAFSA purposes or Title IV federal student aid purposes, not IRS purposes. So if your student was not declared as a dependent on your tax return, that does not mean that they aren't going to be considered a dependent on your FAFSA. It's two different sets of rules. The questions that the FAFSA asks regarding student dependency are a slew of yes/no questions. If all of the answers are no, then parent information is required because the student is a dependent. If the answer is yes to any question, the student is independent. So what kind of questions are they? Excellent question, Mr. Fleck. I knew I could count on you to ask that.
I've got some other follow-ups once you're done.
Oh, good. Okay. Great. So the questions are, is the student a veteran? Are they active duty? Are they married? Are they supporting or providing more than 50% support for their children? Things of that nature. Are they in foster care? Are they a ward of the court? Have they sued their parents to make their own decisions, also known as emancipation? These kinds of things. If the answer is no to those kinds of questions, then parent information is going to be needed. But Mr. Fleck has more questions. Shoot, Mr. Fleck.
All right, so actually there was a question related to when a child may not be considered a dependent, but you just touched upon that. There's a couple other questions that I think you're going to address as we go forward, but there were some questions about how much time on average does it take to complete a FAFSA or any of the other forms? And also there was one question that actually came through on the YouTube chat, and which is fine, but just as a reminder, please try to use the Google form so we make sure we don't miss anything. But also, is there a deadline for when the FAFSA needs to be filed by? So how much time does the form take, and is there a deadline by when it must be submitted?
So the FAFSA, depending on your family's circumstances and situation, can be 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes. Some families can spend a lot more time discussing instead of answering questions mechanically. So it could be more review time. I've always counseled families and said, if it takes you an hour and you can obtain a grant for $5,000, then you made $5,000 an hour for that 1 hour. And I think that's a pretty good return on your time. The FAFSA is built to be as easy as possible, and it will get easier based on new legislation that was passed late in 2020. It's not going to help you for 22, 23, but it might help you for 23, 24. The time required for the other applications for an individual school or college, or say the CSS profile, those tend to be more labor intensive. So I used to work with the CSS profile on a regular basis, and I can tell you that it might take you 20 minutes, half hour to do the FAFSA. The CSS profile is going to beat the FAFSA on steroids, so it might be another hour and a half. And then if you're going to complete a state aid application, that's another 20 minutes. So what I would advise is that you circle a Saturday on your calendar. You get a big cup of coffee, you get a copy of your taxes, and you spend some time completing these forms. It can be a couple of hours. It can also be 20 minutes. It all depends on your own family's situation. Does that answer it, Mr. Fleck? Are there others?
So we have a couple others that are kind of related to the topic. If parents are divorced, how do they file the FAFSA?
So remember that it's the student's FAFSA. And so you would include the parent information on the FAFSA for the parent that provides more support, right? So, and I know family circumstances can be unique because some families are 50-50, right? You spend half of the time with one parent, half with the other. The family would have to decide who provides more support. Financial aid offices may sometimes default to who does the student live with. And if you're applying to a school that is going to ask you for the CSS profile, they will also ask you for the non-custodial parent income information through that non-custodial parent profile. So for the FAFSA, it's who provides the most support, but then depending on the school, the other parent may also be involved. If the other parent is not in the picture, if they fled, if they're incarcerated, if who knows where they are, then for FAFSA purposes, it's easy. You include your one parent and you move on. For the schools that are going to ask for the non-custodial parent income information, you really want to reach out to that school and ask them what the process is to waive the non-custodial parent income information. Yes, Ms. Fuentes.
I was just wondering, I know often there's a question about how, if at all, is a step parent, if the student resides with a step parent, how is their financial situation looked at, if at all?
It's household income information. Excellent question. And so if the student, if the biological mother and father have divorced and the student lives with the father who has remarried, the FAFSA will ask for household income information. So that would be parent, step parent income information. And if you're doing a CSS profile for a CSS profile school, that means that you would also have to jump through the hoops of the non-custodial parent application or waiver process. So that's the rules and regs there. Is your hand up for another question? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Mr. Fleck, who's next? More questions? Oh, sorry.
So, sorry, my screen kind of froze there for a moment. If married, head of household, or married filed separately cannot use the IRS Data Retrieval tool, do you need to do it with paper, or is there another option?
So you can still do it on the web. It's just you can't import data from the IRS automatically. So please don't confuse those two things. You can complete your FAFSA online or through the app, but you won't have access to the special IRS import data feature. So what does that mean? That means that you should be armed with your federal income tax return, or you should have it handy on your desk while you're doing your FAFSA to be able to answer your income tax questions, right? It's going to ask you what wages were earned by parent one for tax year 2020. And then it'll say, this can be found on line 7 of your 1040. So then if you have your 1040 there, you can find line 7 and then just key in whatever numbers those are. So if you're not eligible for the data retrieval tools, that's okay. You can still do FAFSA on the web. You can bypass paper, but you will want to have your tax forms handy when you're doing your FAFSA.
And then we had a question about, you said there's no income threshold for needs-based aid. Is there a simple calculator that families can use to determine if they might be eligible before taking the time to complete a FAFSA?
Every school is required to have a net price calculator. So if you're considering school A and school B, they should have a link on their website for a net price calculator where you could key in your income information, your asset information, and it should spit out for you the best guess for your eligibility. It's going to vary from school to school. And it's only as good as the information you put in. So I'll give you a hypothetical example. If your family made $500,000 last year, but you forget a 0 when you're inputting information into the net price calculator, and you only key in 50, it's going to be a little bit different, right, when you get your aid package in comparison to when you did the net price calculator. So you will just want to make sure that you understand it's an estimate, and it's only as good as the information that's keyed in.
And we also have a question related to the FAFSA that came through on the YouTube chat. If need for a FAFSA arises in the 3rd or 4th year of college, should families be applying in year 1 itself, or can they apply as the need arises?
That's completely up to you. I'm a financial aid person, and so I review FAFSAs for a living. So I'm going to tell you to apply early, apply often. If you don't want to apply year 1 and year 2, but then something changes and you want to do your FAFSA year 3, that's totally fine. These are our benefits, our federal benefits that your student is entitled to use should they wish to do so. They are certainly not required to do so, but they can. It is their option to flex. So yeah, absolutely. And to go even further, if you don't do it year 1, but you do it year 2, or if you do it late year 1, the school is required to process aid for you, particularly federal aid. They can't just say no because insert a reason. These are federal benefits for you, with specifically your student, and so we can't say no for federal aid. Now, merit aid, it's up to the school, and there's rules and deadlines. But for federal aid, you can do it as long as the student is enrolled in that year. The school can process aid for you.
Great. And just to the person who had a question about merit scholarships, I have seen your question. I know that'll be a topic we address shortly, so I'm saving that for when we get there, but I want to acknowledge that I do see your question.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. Fleck. Moving on. Yes?
Yes.
All right. Information about parents of dependent students. So if you answered no to all of the dependency status questions, and the FAFSA says we need parent information, what information are we going to need? We're going to need tax, income, and other financial information. We're going to ask for dislocated worker status. We are going to ask if anyone in the household is receiving any means-tested federal benefits and has in the previous 2 years. We may ask for assets, which would exclude retirement assets and your primary home. I'll say that part again. The FAFSA will ask you for asset information, but it will specifically exclude retirement asset information and your primary home. So you should not report that information on the FAFSA ever. It's one of the most commonly misreported things on the FAFSA, which is why I'm making a huge point about it now. And lastly, they will also ask for untaxed income. So if you received unemployment benefits in 2020 because of COVID and they were untaxed, you would report on your untaxed unemployment benefits onto your FAFSA. Information about a student and the student's spouse, if they're married, we're going to ask for the student and their spouse's tax, income, and other financial information, their dislocated worker status, if they received any means tested federal benefits in the previous 2 years, student asset information, and untaxed income for the student. So similarly, if the student worked and then was laid off because of COVID and then had unemployment benefits that were untaxed, you would report those benefits here onto your FAFSA. Additional information, the FAFSA will ask you which schools you want to send your FAFSA to. It will limit you to 10 schools, but if you have more than 10, if you're considering 15 schools, you submit your FAFSA for the first 10 schools, then you go back in and you erase 5 of them, you put in your next 5, and then you submit it again. And that's how you get your FAFSA to every school. The college will never know what other school is listed on your FAFSA. So you can add as many or as little as you'd like. It's still going to be free. Hopefully the college counselors at Edgemont can help you narrow down your choices from 15 to hopefully 5, something. Yeah, anyway, housing plans we will ask for. And if you are using a paid FAFSA preparer, that you indicate that on your FAFSA. The FAFSA will also ask you for signatures. So a student signature and one parent signature. Again, if your student is a dependent student, how would you provide that? You would do that using the FSA ID, which we talked about briefly. If you're doing a paper FAFSA, we're going to ask for a signature page that you'd have to mail to the PO box for the Department of Ed in Kentucky. And that's where they will scan it and begin processing your paper FAFSA. Some frequent FAFSA errors. Student social security numbers are frequent. A divorced or widowed or remarried parental information that is oftentimes excluded. Income earned by parent or the step parent. Untaxed income. One of my least favorites, the U.S. income taxes paid is oftentimes wrong. Folks pay income taxes when they get a paycheck. If you pay something that we can exclude from your eligibility calculation, we want to give you all of that credit. So please report the taxes that you paid appropriately. The household size, the number of people in your household that are in college, and real estate and investment net worth are oftentimes frequent. Folks will report their primary home when they should not. Folks will report their retirement assets when they should not. So those are the frequent errors. What happens when you submit a FAFSA? You send your FAFSA, you click the submit button on the app, it will go to the central processing system, not Child Protective Services, and they will send a copy to the student as well as to the college that you listed. So that's how your FAFSA is processed. Students, once the FAFSA is processed, will receive an email notification of their student aid report or their SAR. If you provided a valid email address, it will be emailed to you, or you can view it electronically at studentaid.gov. If you completed a paper FAFSA, the SAR will be mailed to you, and the acknowledgement will be sent if FAFSA on the web is filed without providing an email address. So if you forget the email address on your FAFSA, the Department of Ed is going to mail you a copy of your student aid report. The school receives an ICER, or an institutional student information record. Again, I told you, financial aid folks, we love our acronyms. And we use the ICER to calculate eligibility, and we may request some additional documentation, some verification documents, and things like that. If you made a mistake, fear not. If you're completing your FAFSA on the web, you can log back in and make changes. You would still have to sign it with the FSA ID. or you can reach out to the school's financial aid office and say, hey, I made a mistake. Here's my substantiating documentation. Please fix my FAFSA for me. If you're doing it on paper, you can also update your paper SAR and mail those changes to the Department of Education. We're nearing the end here. So special circumstances, right? Sometimes folks' financial lives are a little bit more complicated than what can fit onto a piece of paper, right? Or onto an app. And there are conditions that exist that cannot be documented within the FAFSA. You really want to begin a conversation with your school's financial aid office to figure out what your best course of action is. Because I don't know what your specific situation is, I would advise you to begin with a phone call and say, look, here's what's happening in my life. How can I help you make my FAFSA more accurate? If there's job loss, because the income, again, that you're reporting is from 2020, say in 2021, one of the parents loses their job, you'd call the school and they would tell you what information they would need. The college itself will review and let you know what additional information is needed. And the decision is up to the school to figure out if your circumstances are going to make an impact on your FAFSA or not. And if so, how much of an impact, all of these things. So please reach out to the school financial aid office to get a better understanding as to what is going to be applicable to your circumstances. What kind of special circumstances? Well, it can be a whole slew of things. Loss of employment, we talked about briefly, unusual uncovered medical or dental expenses, secondary school tuition, if the student is unable to obtain parental information, if you have extraordinary dependent care costs, if there's divorce, if God forbid somebody were to pass away, all of these things aren't going to fit on your FAFSA. And so these are some of the circumstances that you would want to call the school about. And that is my slide deck, team. Mr. Fleck, I think you got some questions for me.
Yes, I do. So a couple of other questions related to the FAFSA. What are the advantages of applying early, the FAFSA early?
The advantages of applying early would be some schools prioritize their campus-based aid based on when the FAFSA comes in. It varies on one school to another. I also think that it can alleviate a point of stress in a relatively otherwise stressful process of applying to college, waiting to hear back, trying to figure out how much it's going to cost. So applying early, I think can help mitigate some of that stress in the household. So those are some advantages, but it's going to vary from one school to another in terms of the spending of the campus-based aid.
And in a similar vein, does filling out the FAFSA applying for financial aid have any impact upon admissions decisions?
That's going to vary from one school to another. Some schools have a need blind admissions process. Others are need aware. You would want to call each school and inquire about what are the implications. Unfortunately, I'm not an admissions person, so I can't really answer that. But Ms. Fuentes may have some additional information.
I can answer a little bit, but I also had a follow-up question. I mean, definitely, I think the best answer is the answer you gave, is that it varies a lot by school. Schools that are need aware, schools that are need blind, need sensitive, need aware, meaning that admissions knows what the financial need of the student is when making a decision. Sometimes that will come into play more when they're taking a student off a waiting list, because at that point, they don't really want to offer a student admission who they can't fund, because at that point, that's kind of cruel at that point, I think. But so I think, and then that can vary. I know people had asked about for if students are international, they can be maybe need blind for domestic students, but need aware, need sensitive to international students. So I think on a case-by-case basis, you want to check with the different schools. I also wanted to throw out there that at least the last time I checked, both the City University of New York system and the State University of New York system will allow students who attended and graduated from high school in New York pay the in-state, the in-state tuition. That's really amazing because they're great institutions, and that's just huge. Yeah, that was.
And if you're charged the in-state rate and you're eligible for a DREAM Act award, you could have tuition covered, right? And so that was the intentionality behind those pieces of legislation is, how do we as a state make that slightly more affordable for folks who are in mixed status families and households?
And the follow-up question I had is that some families, have asked, in the same vein, if stating that I'm going to apply for aid, it could impact admission, what happens if, the student is admitted and then after they're admitted, I apply for aid, but I said I wasn't going to? Can I do that?
I think that you can do that. I don't know what that means for from an admissions standpoint. Again, I'm not an admissions person. I'm a financial aid person. I'm here to help you find dollars to attend school. But I can tell you that a school can't choose to not process your federal aid. It's not up to the school. If you don't apply for federal aid through the entire admissions process, you swing past May 1st, and then it becomes June 9th, as it is today. You can complete your FAFSA today, and the school has to process your aid eligibility for the upcoming year. So take that for what it's worth.
Thank you.
So we also have a question. Do families need to apply to complete the FAFSA each year?
Yes. For each year that you would like to be considered for free money. So if you don't want to be considered, that's fine. You don't have to. But again, I'm the early and often guy.
And this question is in relation to the CSS Profile, which again is a secondary form that not every college uses, but many schools, particularly private institutions, use through the College Board website. But some of the additional questions, the CSS Profile asks about my primary residence. How do I determine the dollar amount to use when completing that? Is it the value that the town or the municipal entity has assessed it at?
So the CSS Profile will ask you for that primary home information. It will also ask you for debt against your primary home. Unless you want to pay for an appraisal, which seems a little bit excessive for a financial aid form, the next best option would be your local town or municipality assessment. Which I know in some places, like you can argue, it's this or that or the other. The CSS Profile also has a cost of living adjustment based on your zip code. So it can be kind of nice in that regard. But yes, you're correct. It is the assessed value unless you get it appraised.
So another question that came through, are students able to get full financial aid through the federal government and FAFSA? If not, are there other options besides a Parent Plus loan? That kind of also then ties back to a question that came in very early on related to merit scholarships. So if you'd also be able to talk a little bit about merit scholarships, particularly those that are not given directly by the college themselves, and how families can go about researching those.
Excellent questions. So when someone asks full financial aid from the Federal Department of Education, full financial aid means one thing for me. It's going to mean something else for Mr. Fleck. It's going to mean something else for whoever asked that. I think what you're trying to drive at is the award amounts, right? Like what's an appropriate expectation of awards from the Federal Department of Education? A maximum Pell Grant is a hair over $6,000 roughly. A maximum TAP grant was just increased in the New York State budget. So it's going to be around $5,500. And that's your maximum eligibility. So if you're high need and you're eligible for everything, you're looking at about $11,000. If that's full, I think we can have another webinar about what full is or not. In terms of trying to find additional merit scholarships, there are some scholarship search engines that you can certainly create a profile for that will try to auto match you to some available scholarships. Depending on the school that you're considering, some of them have foundations that are set up that have scholarships that you must apply for in addition to be considered for. So you'd want to check at your school of choice. Another trusted place that I would point you to is the College Board has a free scholarship search engine of vetted scholarships, and that would be applicable to whether you're applying to a CSS Profile school or not. Like me and Mr. Fleck could both hop onto the College Board website and start hunting for scholarships for our own new undergraduate adventure. So there are plenty of opportunities for you to try and find these things. I think that students should search for merit scholarships always. It should be a part-time job, in my opinion, mostly because I hate student loan debt. So what does that mean? As we discussed earlier, trying to find local opportunities where you have a higher percentage likelihood that you would be selected is a good starting point. There's possibly 5 or 10 total applications that might be applicable to you locally, and then to your college to see what they have in addition to what they're going to review for or how they do merit scholarships. And then above that, you're looking at like a national search. So things like the College Board or other websites that would have the ability for you to make a profile and then have it auto match so that you can kind of filter through, a country's worth of scholarship applications to what's really applicable to you.
And I'm just looking, and that was all the questions that came through on the Google form, as well as in the chat on the YouTube feed.
Maximo, can I just ask, I knew in the past, but I don't know if this is true anymore. There have been occasions at some schools when they won't release scholarship funds or some other funds unless a FAFSA is on file. And in some cases, I know is that not something that is a practice that you're familiar with?
Not that I'm familiar with. So when you say release, like, do you mean like dispersed or
dispersed,
like
dispersed, right? Because I've at times families have said, I know that we're not going to be eligible for aid. Is there any reason that I should file this form? And I said, you should definitely file it because you never know. You don't file it, you can't get the aid just because, but and in my experience, but it's, when I was admissions is fairly long time ago, there were some cases in which a student would get maybe a merit scholarship, but the funds couldn't be dispersed to the student unless there was a FAFSA on file. I didn't know if that was ever.
If there's a merit scholarship that has a need component, maybe.
Okay.
It's possible. We don't have any of those at Lemoyne College. I don't think that those are particularly common because a merit scholarship is based on your talent or your, like if you're an excellent oboist and you got a full tuition scholarship to play oboe, right? Then congratulations, you play oboe, some money comes in. If you're an athlete and you're receiving an athletic scholarship, it doesn't matter if you have a FAFSA or not, unless that's stipulated in your NCAA a letter of intent. So it doesn't sound, it's not something that I think is very common, but is possible.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we've now had a couple more questions come in. One going back to merit scholarships. When is a good time to start applying for merit-based scholarships? So schools will often use the information on your Common App or your application for admission to review for merit scholarships. So as you would apply for admission, that's your timeline. If your student is currently a junior, is going to be a senior comes this upcoming fall, applying to go to college 2 falls from now, you can certainly start researching or trying to triage, which scholarships you want to apply for now, but the application isn't going to be due, right, for that year, probably for, a few months at this point. So you can certainly start doing some prelim searching now, but the actual applying
it would be this fall into the winter, possibly next spring, if that makes sense.
And one piece I would add to that is similar to how colleges may have slightly different deadlines for admissions, merit scholarships can set their own deadlines based on their criteria. So that's always a good piece, I think, to research as well, not just what the scholarship is for, who is eligible, but when would that application go live and when would that application be due, so you can collect materials and be meeting those deadlines. We also had a question regarding 1040s. How does my 1040 adjusted gross income or monetary assets impact my EFC? What's the rough calculation?
Maximo, can I just interrupt for 1 second to say we have a we're gonna have final questions in the next couple of minutes. So if there's anybody who had a question they haven't been able to ask, now's the time. Thanks.
So the rough calculation is hard to do just with that information. I would need to know whose assets they are, if they're student assets or parent assets, because that is going to change the calculation significantly. How many people are in your household and how many of those people are attending college for the applicable year? Because believe it or not, it can split, right? Say your EFC is $50,000, but you are going to 2 in college, it's going to get cut between those 2 students. So it's not that easy. I wish I could answer it for you. If your AGI is say $30,000, there is an income protection allowance on the FAFSA as there is on the CSS profile. So it accounts for your basic living expenses. It accounts for anticipated savings for retirement, after tax retirement, as well as like student educational savings. It tries to account for all of these things as best as it can. So I can't really give you a rough, quick and dirty back of the napkin calculation without more information. I would encourage you to try and find a net price calculator, spend 5 minutes and see what you could come up with. I'm sure that you could play around for at least a half hour.
Thank you. And I'm just looking, that looks like that is all the questions that have come through.
Okay, well, thanks everyone so much for being with us, and for those of us who watch it in the future. Maximo, I just want to say thank you so much. You've been incredibly helpful, and I think, you know, shed a lot of light on questions that families are having, and we really appreciate you being with us tonight.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for hosting. Happy applying, happy FAFSA filing. Please don't forget to call your financial aid administrator of choice to ask lots of questions, because they love to answer the questions ahead of time to prevent you and them a whole bunch of headaches and work. So please ask questions. We like it, believe it or not.
Thanks so much. Have a good night.